Sometimes Narnia is just weird. I mean, every now and then there are these moments that happen that just make you say, wait, what? And here's what I've come to realize. Those weird little moments, they're usually a sort of X marks the spot. They're a sign that if you dig down a bit deeper, you'll discover there's a treasure of meaning buried just beneath the surface. And one of those odd moments happened in the Narnia year 1014, during the events that were recorded in The Horse and His Boy, when two certain refugees encountered a strange man known only as the Hermit of the Southern March. Now, until now, not much has been known about this mysterious character who seems to disappear from Narnia as quickly as he arrives, yet he holds a profound place in the pages of Narnian history. But today, I'm excited to reveal what I believe may be a rather profound theory about the identity of this mysterious stranger. Now, if you're watching this episode, chances are it's because you're not only a fan of literature, but you're also someone who enjoys digging deeper into the most important truths of life. And if that's you, then the best college that you can choose is Boyce College. Because Boyce College in Louisville prepares graduates for the what and the who they will be after college. Now, one way Boyce accomplishes this is through a life of discipleship. What students learn in class and during chapel gets lived out on campus and in the community. Each student is required to actively participate in a local church, and there are dozens of biblically faithful churches located only minutes from campus, and Boyce College will happily help you make that connection. Now, you can learn more about Boyce College by visiting boycecollege.com/faith. And of course, a huge shout out to the supporters of this channel on Patreon. Now, some of these folks have been faithful supporters for years, and others are joining the ranks all the time. Now, no matter how long you've been a part of this community, I am so thankful for all of you. Now, there's no time to waste, so let's get started. It's time to leave the Shadowlands behind and step into a world that's more real than our own. It's time to follow me into the wardrobe. Now, before we get into what we know about the Hermit, some of you may need a bit of a refresher on your Narnian history. Now, if you recall, we meet the Hermit during the Golden Age of Narnia, a time when the Pevensie siblings ruled the nation of Narnia and the country was in a prosperous time of post-war recovery, after the White Witch had been defeated at the First Battle of Baruna. However, in Narnia, as in our world, times of peace are often short-lived, and those who desire power will always seek to take what's precious. And so, Prince Rapidash of the great southern nation of Calormen gathered his father's army and led them on a march across the great desert toward Archenland. His plan was to first seize control of that small nation, and then use their strategic position to invade Narnia. And this was the reason that Shasta and Travis, along with their horses, Hwin and Bree, were racing across the great desert on a harrowing journey to warn the Archenlanders of Rabidash's surprise attack. Now, when the party reached the southern border of Archenland, just on the edge of the great desert, they were exhausted, frightened, and Travis was even wounded. They were also being chased by a giant lion, but that's for another video. And so, there on the edge of the great desert and the foothills of the mountains of Archenland, the group literally ran into a strange man, standing in the middle of his walled gateway. He was dressed down to his bare feet in a robe colored like autumn leaves and leaning on a straight staff. His beard fell almost to his knees, and at first Shasta guessed that this man might be King Lune of Archenland. But the old man identifies himself only as the Hermit of the Southern March. Now, just a quick side note, a march, as you may or may not know, refers to a type of borderland, sort of a neutral zone between two realms, which may have referred to the border between Archenland and Calormen, or, as you'll soon see, it may actually refer to something else entirely. Now, the Hermitage was also an interesting place. It was described as being surrounded by a 10-foot, perfectly circular wall made of turf, and inside the perimeter was a small stone house on one far edge, along with some goats, and in the middle was a deep pool with very still water, and completely overshadowing it with its branches, there grew, and I quote, "the hugest and most beautiful tree that Shasta had ever seen." Now, as the story goes on, there are a few more things we learn about the nameless hermit. First of all, he's very old. He tells us that he has lived 109 winters in this world. Now, since the old man lived outside of the borders of Narnia proper and thus outside the reach of the White Witch's eternal curse, we can assume that these winters really do represent actual Narnian years. He's also a very hospitable person. Now, most hermits, you might imagine, would avoid visitors from the outside world, but this man went out of his way to not only welcome the party, but also to care for Aravis for several days afterwards. Hospitality seemed to be something very important to this man. And finally, the old hermit also had the supernatural gift of second sight. He was a seer, and by gazing into the pool, he had the ability to see, like looking into a mirror, the events of anything that was currently happening in Narnia. From the cities even farther south than Tashbaan, to the far eastern ports of Redhaven in the remote Seven Isles, even to the western woods in the far land of Telmar. So on the surface, that's really all that we know. But again, the question still stands. Who exactly is this mysterious yet prominent figure in Narnian history? And where did he come from? Well, let me tell you about another man who has a surprisingly great deal of things in common with this hermit of the Southern March. Now, he's a man from our world named Anthony, otherwise known as Saint Anthony the Great, who was born in 251 AD. Now, you may already be familiar with him, and there's no doubt that as a medieval scholar, C.S. Lewis would have known him as well, because his biography, The Life of Saint Anthony, was one of the best known pieces of Christian literature in the world well into the Middle Ages. Some of you may already know that Saint Anthony was also a hermit, one of the first hermit monks. In fact, he's known as the father of monasticism. But he has so much more in common with the Hermit of the Southern March than just that. Now, first of all, just like the Hermit of the Southern March, who lived just beyond the edge of the Great Desert and beside the mountains of Arkenland, St. Anthony's hermitage was located on the edge of the Great Egyptian Desert, also along the foothills of the great mountain Pispir, now called Der El Memem, and I'm sure I've butchered that pronunciation. And while the Narnian hermitage was surrounded by a 10-foot wall made of turf and stone, seemingly a mini fortress of sorts, St. Anthony's hermitage was actually an old abandoned Roman fort, which was also commonly made of turf and stone. Now, just across the desert from St. Anthony was Alexandria, one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, which runs along the western coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, Anthony was famous for traveling to the city to preach against the religious practices of the Alexandrians, and he spoke out against their great evil for worshiping demons that were masquerading as beasts instead of the true God. Now, does this sound familiar? Because just across the desert from the Hermit of the Southern March was another great seaside city named Tashbaan, which was the namesake of the demon god of Calormen, Tash. Now, one of the most memorable things about the Hermit of the Southern March was that while he was a recluse, he was also incredibly welcoming and hospitable to Shasta's fleeing party. And as we've already mentioned, besides welcoming them in without hesitation in a moment when they needed him the most, he even went above and beyond in his kindness, as over the next few days he tended to the care of Aravis, who had been wounded during their flight. And as for St. Anthony, well, he is famously known for his remarkable hospitality towards others, often welcoming visitors to his hermitage who sought him out for help and wisdom. In fact, when the Order of the Knights Hospitaller was formed nearly 1,000 years ago, with the mission of caring for the sick and the needy, they adopted St. Anthony as their patron saint. And finally, there's the hermit's gift of second sight. Now, the Hermit of the Southern March had the unique ability to see across great distances at events happening in real time in the world of Narnia. And in our world, it was said that when St. Anthony would retreat to solitude in the mountains, he would often see visions of what was happening in Egypt at that very moment. So, as you can see, there are some stunning parallels between the Hermit of the Southern March and St. Anthony. And some may say it's pretty clear that the Hermit of our world served as a model for the hermit in the Narnian realm. But is that all there is to it? Just a striking resemblance? Well, here's where fact ends and theory begins. See, let me tell you one last detail about the life of St. Anthony that may surprise you. And this is a 100% actual account taken directly from his biography. In the later years of his life, St. Anthony embarked on the most famous journey in the desert when he was about 90 years old. And it was on this journey that he encountered something there in the middle of the great Egyptian desert that you or I may find unexplainable and definitely shocking. Because again, according to historical account, there in the middle of the desert, St. Anthony stumbled upon an actual, real-life centaur who promptly spoke some strange gibberish and ran away. But it gets even stranger because moments later, he also came face to face with a faun. I kid you not, they even had a friendly conversation. It's like the beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, except almost exactly in reverse. Instead of a young girl, it was an old man. Instead of a freezing snowy forest, it was a hot, dry desert. And instead of stumbling from our world into Narnia, it seemed to be the other way around. So perhaps the threads to Narnia run stronger than we could have imagined. Is it possible that while stumbling around in the Egyptian desert, St. Anthony happened to discover a thin place? Or, as they're described in Prince Caspian, one of the magical chinks or chasms between our world and Narnia? Perhaps he discovered a magical oasis out there in the desert, maybe with a cool pool just perfect for wading in, and perhaps, like other pools in the multiverse, this one was a portal directly to Narnia. Now, it would make sense then for a hermit to build a wall around this magical portal as a sort of ultimate hermitage, a true escape from our world. And maybe that's the reason that the Narnian hermit was being so oddly specific when he described himself as having lived, and I quote, 109 winters in this world. And maybe when he called himself the Hermit of the Southern March, the march he was describing was just a different kind of borderland. Not a borderland between countries, but between this world and the world of Narnia. Well, that's the theory. And whether or not you believe it, you can be sure of this, that whether it's in Narnia or in our world, sometimes it's the stories that are the most unbelievable that are the ones really worth believing. Do you know the 3 most asked questions from parents who are searching for the right fit college for their student? Find the questions and the answers at boycecollege.com/faith.